Show of hands, how many of you have been building AI pipelines for 3 years or more? Raise your hand. 3 years or more. Okay, so lots of newer folks here, and really just want to emphasize that today's multimodal AI feels a bit like magic. And so even just 3 years ago, you had these intense multimodal pipelines, and even just the one up here is a pretty simple one, but you've got an audio pipeline, and it's got tons of steps associated with it. And nowadays, we've been seeing a lot more in 2025, multi-agent pipelines, agents handling everything multimodal. So nowadays, you can go into ChatGPT, you can ask it to analyze your audio, and it'll just do that. It feels a little bit like magic, whether it's audio, video, images, or even just a combination of the two. The problem is not what we see in these demos. These demos work great, but then how do we get that into production? So the complexity of a lot of these AI agents is still hidden beneath the surface. So everything you saw in terms of that pipeline that I showed is still living underneath here. Everything from the data ingestion, normalization, conversion of data types. And really what's happening here is you're seeing the surface. So when you're making a vendor call, it's swallowing all of these transformations, and you lose the places where you would normally observe, log, and evaluate what is going on in your system. And so therefore, errors are becoming opaque, logic is becoming commingled, and without those checkpoints and attachment points where you would typically evaluate, you can't introspect where your product is working and where it isn't. And you're left inferring from this output that you see, was it working or not, instead of being able to look at those intermediate signals. And so what we're going to be talking about today is opening that box, taking a lot of these closed box, closed loop input to output systems, and really being able to inspect underneath them and understand what is going on underneath and how can we dig deeper to see that that is actually working the way we expect it to in production. And this visibility is mattering even more and more with the more frequent model upgrades that are happening, because that's when you get subtle behavior changes happening with every release. Okay. Sorry. I don't know what's going on here. Oh. Okay, sorry about that. So across modalities, the symptoms look similar here, and in particular, we've got just a bunch of hidden valuable data that we can get here. And I just want to go into each modality into a little bit more detail because I've worked with some of these modalities in the past. So if you're working with audio, then sometimes you might be missing voice activity detection, diarization, intent of the voice. On vision and UI systems, you might be missing what elements are detected, what objects are detected. If you're looking at the final output, you might be missing some of those. And with docs or RAG, you might have pieces of grounding information that you want to see in the inside. And with agents and tools, you might be missing tool calls or what is getting passed within those tool calls. So we'll be talking about all of those internals of the system today. And so one thing I hear a lot as we talk about multimodal systems and why the box has closed over time is because building from scratch is really, really hard. And a lot of these closed box systems were built with the intention of making it easier for you to build. And there's lots of different considerations that people have when they're building and deploying these systems into production. You might be thinking about, oh, well, how much time is it going to take me to build this system? Or how much time is it going to take me to orchestrate? Or what does maintenance and versioning look like? And all of those pieces are very difficult, but they don't have to be. you don't have to build all of these infrastructure pieces from scratch to open the box. And that's what I think the beauty of open source tooling is nowadays, is that you have the ability to inspect underneath that closed box without having to build from scratch. So I was going to share some of those techniques today. And so really the first thing I want to mention is, instead of reinventing the wheel here, we want to stand on the patterns and interfaces that you are able to control. So going into this next slide, really instead of starting with the model, let's start with the outcomes that we owe the user. So thinking about your business outcomes that you are trying to achieve when you're building your AI agent. And really thinking about the two families of outcomes that you might have. So subjective outcomes and objective outcomes. Thinking about, subjectively, is the AI agent you're building doing everything that your users are expecting it to? And you hear that through user feedback, or you might hear it on Twitter threads when people talk about taste, or you might hear it in terms of alignment to brand identity, alignment to overall AI safety needs. All of those things are somewhat the subjective side of business outcomes that we see. And then there's the objective side. So as you're looking into your system, is it perceiving everything that you need it to? So in terms of all the different modalities, that might look like reliable object detection. It might look like transcription is working properly, or parsing. And then grounding is another one of these objective ones. Is the system of record anchored to verifiable evidence, wanting to get these traceable links back to sources that actually exist, decision making? So as you've got this perception and grounding happening, are the decisions that are being made by the agent actually the right decisions, aligned with what you would expect the system to be making? And then, of course, performance. So user visualized performance, like overall latency of the system and overall memory usage, all of those different types of objective outcomes that everyone is looking to optimize with their business. And then from these business outcomes, you can start to determine the intermediate signals to capture under each of these different families of systems. So really, one thing I want to emphasize is that modern SDKs can actually expose a lot of this. So they do expose tool calls, step outputs, media references, but this has been silently added over the past year. If you look at the past year, we've gone from chat completions, for instance, which was outputs and logits, to now responses API, which has full traceability of tool calls and what the system is thinking in between. So really, even the SDKs can help to open that box a little bit. And if you are simply persisting just the request and response envelope, there is definitely an opportunity to expand beneath that and capture a rich set of intermediate signals without even building custom plumbing on day one. And so now that we've named some of these signals that matter, the question is, for your system, where do they live, and how do we keep the relationship between them trustworthy over time? And so that's where really working consistently within a database and having lineage that you can query is really super helpful. And so really, exposing those checkpoints gives us visibility, but visibility isn't enough. We need traceability. And to get that traceability, we can produce every single table the same way and record how we made what from which inputs and when. And that's exactly what declarative database pipelines can give you: clear lineage by construction. So you can include the entire configuration to recreate the data in the database itself. And then from there, you can define the pipeline as computed columns and views that automatically derive all of the information that you're building out in your multimodal agent. And that gives you all of those intermediate signals that you're then feeding in to make decisions and to evaluate your app. And because they are declarative, they're idempotent and replayable, so the same inputs will yield the same results. And so rather than implementing your pipeline as scattered code, you can organize that schema around the intermediate signals and let the database express the pipeline. And that just results in a more consistent, inspectable data flow where lineage is guaranteed by the contract of the database. So once you've made your data flow declarative, then it's time to apply the same discipline to the checks at the end, or really the checks in the middle. So any evaluations that you're doing within your system can also be declarative. And so the shift that I made in my mind was treating evaluations like a first-class data source, not just a throwaway script that you run every single time you need evaluations. So thinking of them as additional computed columns, as additional generated data that you're just generating every single time you're running in production is just so much more helpful to keep those evaluations into place. And most of us are already doing this in some shape or form. We're doing it for decision making. So when you're making tool calls, if you're feeding in data as a result of that, that's a partial evaluation. You might be doing more extensive ones offline, but definitely there's really a lot of evaluations that are getting done with the data that you're generating nowadays. So it's not a crazy idea to think of evaluations as just a part of your database. And so I treat evaluations a little bit like a data contract, again, similar to the way that I structure the database declaratively, structure evals declaratively. So some of you might run A/B tests and you might run evaluations on parts of your data. We also do the same, but we select those samples of data directly from production and we make that a declarative contract within the database so that all of these evaluations, it's really traceable what we're doing. And so moving on to some of the considerations that we think about a lot of times when we're thinking about building feedback loops and evaluations specifically. One of the biggest ones I tend to hear is around latency and how might latency get affected if you are doing your evaluations as a part of the database. And really, I think most folks' goal is to maximize the amount of feedback, maximize the evaluations that you can get while minimizing overall latency. And so really, I think of this in hot paths and cold paths. What are you going to do on your online evaluations that are directly within the critical path of the system versus what are you going to do offline and maybe batch that or run that asynchronously. And really anything that involves a user decision here or something that a user needs to feel, anything really in line is where we do the online evaluations and we actually do those synchronously in our database to make decisions. So anything involving a tool call or any large decision that sends the agent to one other place is something that we've brought into the online system. And then on the offline system, we can do a lot more extensive evaluations. And they don't just mean that we're doing them someday. We're just batching those and running them asynchronously outside of the critical path of our production system. So sometimes this means taking a larger model to do LLM as a judge evaluations and seeing whether that agrees with some of our more in the critical path evaluations and having all of that in the database so that we can go back and query it over time. So even if we're not running a particular study today, we have that data for when we do want to run that study. And so another thing I want to mention with respect to this is around model upgrades and how we run those in particular. So really, for us, that is a shadow run. So basically, whenever we are looking at upgrading a model, we actually have an offline path that goes and runs with the other model side by side, another column in the database that we can go and just directly compare to what we have in production. And that just gives us the data that we need to be confident to switch to Claude Sonnet 4.5 or not. And I know with new models coming out every month or every week, it feels like that is something where having this declarative system where you can just run it and you don't have to keep maintaining or building scripts or trying to remember how the heck was this data generated is just so much of an unlock for these systems. And continuing along that path, just want to talk a little bit about other experimentation that you might do. So as I alluded to previously, like you might be considering A/B testing or other different types of experimentation. Really, the thing is, if you start your data structure with the business outcomes and the intermediate signals that you're gathering, even if you change some of that approach underneath, that can still be the same data that you structure with. So for instance, we've done some experiments where we were using traditional object detection models on images, but then we wanted to see if LLMs could do the object detection. How good are VLMs at performing this object detection? So really taking the intermediate signal of the objects that got detected and how close that was to our expected set in terms of UI elements, that's what we were detecting. That was real unlock for us. We didn't have to change our entire pipeline to be able to change from a object detection model to a VLM. And that is because the data structure remains the same. It's just the approach and the configuration that changes. Okay, to conclude here, just want to encourage folks to be opening that box as you get these opportunities to run more and more frictionless SDKs that are just input to output. Look underneath and see how will you open that box? How can you find those explainable checkpoints underneath that you can store in your database so that you don't have to scramble when you need them. You can set them up when you set your system up, and really making that lineage and the set of evaluations that you're running declarative, and really splitting out the evals by online versus offline. So that's my presentation, and I'm open for questions if anyone has questions on anything. Yeah.
I'll repeat it for the audience. So, yeah, I just asked more about what you're building and how you're, applying these things, that the lessons learned and that type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Variata, we're building computer use agents, and we're building computer use agents that interact with web and mobile experiences, acting like a user to find friction in basically people's app experience. And so we do a lot of work with computer vision, and particularly being able to see the screen, being able to make various tool calls, reasoning, such. And then before that, I worked at Octo AI, which was MLOps infrastructure company that was basically deploying open models. So think your Llama family or Mistral models, and we were making decisions based off of our customers' needs, which models are most well suited to it. So I was directly involved with building out the eval sets and running the evaluations continuously to understand, as a new model came out, does it make economic and business sense to be deploying that model for our customers? Oh.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation. In regards to evals, have you found a strategy for what makes a valuable evaluation? Or is it like a numbers game of the more things you're tracing, the better? Or how do you find the value from the noise?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's an amount of signal that each evaluation might tell you. And so sometimes people may find that human feedback is the highest signal and leads to those business outcomes. So I like to think of it as how close of a proxy can this particular piece of data proxy to those business outcomes that were defined at the beginning. And so actually at my previous role, we were building out like an SLoRa system for a bunch of different like Studio Ghibli style basically artwork for them, and basically their overall system was taste. They wanted to go viral on Twitter, but really what that meant for them was overall engagement patterns and like how were people interacting with the platform. Were they generating the same image over and over again because they didn't like the results, or were they generating lots of different images, and also how similar in terms of like overall style did it look to previously generated images that had received a lot of likes. So those were the types of evaluations that we built out to proxy to that business outcome.